They called the B-17 the Flying Fortress. But to many of the men who climbed aboard, it often felt more like a flying coffin. From the moment crews strapped themselves into the narrow fuselage, they knew the odds were stacked heavily against them. Long-range missions over occupied Europe meant flying through endless miles of enemy airspace, where German fighters and flak batteries waited with merciless precision. The bomber's thick skin and defensive guns gave it an air of invincibility in posters and propaganda, but the reality was far grimmer. Every takeoff was a gamble. Crews joked darkly about drawing lots for who would return, but behind the nervous laughter was real fear. Loss rates on certain missions reached staggering numbers, entire formations cut to pieces before they even reached their targets. The men in those glass noses and gun turrets weren't just statistics. They were fathers, brothers, sons who watched their friends' planes explode or spiral down in flames, powerless to help. The bomber formations themselves became symbols of sacrifice. Hundreds of aircraft would thunder across the sky, but by the time they limped back, gaps scarred the neat boxes where planes had once flown. Survivors described looking down the line and counting empty spaces where their comrades should have been. The silence on the return flight was heavy, each man privately wondering how long his luck would hold. For the crews who kept flying, fear became a constant companion. They were awed by the courage of their fellow airmen, but the fortress's reputation was a bitter irony. It was strong, yes, but never strong enough to shield everyone. The stage was set for a desperate search for answers, a way to change the math of survival before too many more were lost. In the early years of daylight bombing campaigns, the skies belonged to the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots flying agile Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore into American bomber streams with ruthless efficiency. For every mile the B-17s pushed toward their targets, waves of fighters slashed through their formations, hammering them with cannon fire. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground added a curtain of black flak, shredding wings, fuselages and nerves alike. The casualty figures were staggering. Some missions saw 1 in 3 crews fail to return. There were days when bases in England waited anxiously for the sound of engines, only to watch squadron after squadron come home a fraction of its original size. The losses were not just numbers on a chalkboard. They meant burned-out bombers crash-landing in fields, empty bunks in barracks, and telegrams arriving at American homes with the dreaded phrase "missing in action." German air superiority seemed absolute. Their pilots were seasoned, confident, and fighting over home territory. American airmen, by contrast, were often fresh, young, and still learning the brutal rhythms of combat. The fear was palpable. Every crewman knew the odds, and could see death waiting in every contrail and every burst of flak. For the men who climbed into the flying fortresses day after day, it felt like walking into a meat grinder. Even their commanders questioned how long such losses could be sustained. And yet amidst this atmosphere of dread, whispers began of a different kind of weapon, not a new gun or a heavier armor plate, but something simpler, something mathematical. American commanders were desperate for answers. After mission reports came in and crews described swarms of German fighters ripping through their formations, the instinctive solution seemed obvious. Add more armor. Engineers responded, bolting steel plates onto the flying fortresses in hopes of giving them a fighting chance. They reinforced wings, patched fuselages, and tried to shield fuel tanks. Yet even with the extra weight and effort, the casualty rates barely budged. Planes were still falling in horrifying numbers. The frustration was overwhelming. For every adjustment, new losses mounted. Officers pored over diagrams, flight logs, and damage reports, searching for patterns. They marked bullet holes across blueprints of the B-17, tracing the areas most frequently riddled with enemy fire. At first glance, it made sense. Fortify the zones where damage was most visible. Yet, the results stubbornly refused to change the grim reality. The more armor they added, the heavier the aircraft became, slowing speeds and cutting into range. Pilots grumbled that the planes felt sluggish. Crews feared that the supposed fixes were only making them easier targets. Every attempt seemed like grasping in the dark. What haunted commanders most was the mystery. How could so many of these flying fortresses designed for durability and survival be falling from the sky despite constant upgrade? It seemed that no matter how much steel they bolted on, the Luftwaffe found a way to rip through it. The numbers did not lie. America was losing too many men, too many planes, and too much time, and still no one could explain why the reinforcements weren't working. For the air crews, the puzzle was personal. They lived with the evidence every time they limped back to base in their battered bombers. Men would stumble out of hatches, clothes reeking of gunpowder and sweat, and point at the torn metal skin of their aircraft. "Look at this," a gunner might mutter, tracing his finger round the jagged edges of a bullet hole. The wings, the fuselage, the tail, all riddled with scars from enemy fire. Some planes looked more like sieves than machines. The ground crews would swarm in, shaking their heads at the damage. Mechanics patched holes with aluminum sheets, rivets clanging late into the night. Medics tended to men wounded by shrapnel or flying debris. Yet somehow, against the odds, these aircraft had made it home. Their bullet holes became stories, tales of survival passed between mess halls and bunks. The returning crews could never ignore the pattern. Again and again, the same areas of the bombers came back scarred, wings peppered, fuselages torn, tails chewed up. To the men, it felt like proof that these spots were the most vulnerable. "If we just put more steel here," one navigator told his friend, "maybe fewer of us will die out there." It seemed to make perfect sense. And yet, beneath the surface, a strange unease grew. Why were so many planes coming back with damage in the same places, while others never returned at all? The holes told part of the story, but they also left a haunting question. What about the bombers that never made it home to show their wounds? In the spring of war, when generals and engineers were grasping for solutions, an unlikely figure was summoned to help. His name was Abraham Wald, a quiet mathematician with a mind sharper than steel. He had no medals, no tales of combat, no hours logged in cockpits under flak-filled sky. Yet he carried something the air war desperately needed: the ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. Wald had fled Europe years earlier, leaving behind the shadow of persecution. In America he had found safety, and now his adopted country was asking him to turn raw numbers into life-saving insight. The problem was laid out before him. Bombers returned from their missions riddled with holes. The military wanted to know where to add more armor, believing that reinforcing those scarred sections would finally tip the odds in their favor. To the officers, the evidence seemed obvious. The wings, the fuselage, the tails, those were the places that came back perforated with enemy fire. Armor those zones, they insisted, and crews would survive. Wald listened patiently, studying the charts and reports stacked on his desk. To him, the bullet holes were not just damage, they were data. Each hole marked a clue, a signal about what the enemy's fire had and had not managed to destroy. It was here that Wald's genius began to stir. He realized the answer wasn't in the planes that limped home covered in scars. It lay hidden in the silence of those that never returned. The empty spaces on the charts, the places without bullet holes, were speaking louder than the torn metal. And Wald was ready to show the world what they meant. When Wald finally spoke, his conclusions startled the room. The officers had expected confirmation of their instincts, yet what they heard instead was the complete opposite. "Don't add armor where the bullet holes are," he explained. "Add armor where the holes are missing." At first, the idea sounded absurd. How could the untouched parts of the returning planes be the ones most in need of protection? Wald calmly laid out his reasoning. The bombers that came home with shredded wings and fuselages were proof of survivability. Those planes could still fly despite the damage. The ones that never returned were likely the ones hit in the places now showing no bullet holes at all. The engines, the cockpit, the fuel system, these were the true weak points. The strikes that guaranteed a crew would never see friendly skies again. The realization shifted the entire perspective of the route. Armor wasn't about covering the wounds they could see. It was about guarding the vital organs of the bomber that once struck, left no survivors to bring the data back. It was a lesson in logic that felt almost like sleight of hand, a trick that turned assumptions upside down. Suddenly the math wasn't abstract anymore. It was a lifeline, a way to turn the brutal arithmetic of war into a strategy that could actually save lives. And for the first time, the men in uniform leaned forward, not with doubt, but with anticipation. They had just witnessed how numbers could outwit bullets. The brilliance of Wald's insight lay in its simplicity. For weeks, commanders had been staring at charts filled with red marks where bullets had torn through returning bombers. To them, the pattern was obvious. Reinforce the wings, the tails, the fuselage where holes clustered like angry constellations. But Wald had seen what no one else did. Those bullet-riddled planes told only half the story. He explained it with quiet clarity. The bombers that limped back home, scarred but still airborne, proved those areas could take punishment. Armor there was almost redundant. Those planes survived precisely because hits in those spots were not fatal. The true danger lay in the empty spaces on the charts. The places that showed no damage at all. Engines without bullet holes weren't evidence of invulnerability. They were evidence of catastrophe. A plane struck there never came home to leave its mark. This subtle but profound shift in perspective was the essence of survivorship bias. The mistake of drawing conclusions only from those who made it through. By looking at the survivors alone, the U.S. Army Air Forces had nearly doomed countless more crews. Wald's revelation flipped the equation. Protect the engines, the cockpit, the fuel tanks, the heart and lifeblood of the bomber. Reinforce the areas with no visible damage, because those were the true killers. The officers in the room sat stuck. A mathematician had shown them that their instincts, sharpened by war, had blinded them. What seemed so obvious was dangerously misleading, and in that revelation lay hope. Perhaps this math could finally turn the tide for the young men flying into the storm of German guns. To the officers, Wald's conclusion sounded almost absurd. For years, military logic dictated that reinforcement went where the enemy fire landed most often. It was the soldier's instinct. Patch the holes, strengthen the battered walls, cover the points of impact. And yet here was a quiet mathematician suggesting the opposite. Ignore the places riddled with bullets, and instead protect the untouched. At first some bristled at the contradiction. How could it make sense to armor where no damage was recorded? To them it felt like gambling with lives, a proposal at odds with every tactical instinct honed in battle. The very charts they studied seemed to scream the opposite of Wald's advice. But as he explained further, the logic began to sink in. The planes that came back were proof of endurance. The planes that didn't return, the ones lost to the skies over Germany, bore the silent evidence of what truly mattered. The shift in thinking was nothing short of revolutionary. By inverting standard reasoning, Wald had forced the U.S. Army Air Forces to see the invisible. Instead of reinforcing scars, they would shield the unseen vulnerabilities. The engines, the cockpit, the fuel system. It was a radical departure from convention, and in its boldness lay its brilliance. The officers realized they weren't simply adjusting armor placement. They were rewriting the way military problems could be solved. Mathematics, of all things, had delivered a perspective sharper than instinct. Shock gave way to respect. What had seemed like a strange, even foolish idea revealed itself as genius. Wald had not only saved bombers on paper, he had shifted the very mindset of a military at war. When Abraham Wald laid his finger on the absence of data, the room fell silent. The officers had been staring at charts full of bullet holes, yet Wald insisted the real message was hidden in the blank spaces. The damage you see, he explained calmly, belongs to the planes that returned. The damage you don't see belongs to the ones that never came back. It was a deceptively simple observation, but it carried the weight of revelation. By shifting attention from the visible scars to the invisible losses, Wald reframed the entire problem. Every hole in the fuselage, the wings, and the tail on a surviving bomber was paradoxically proof of resilience. These aircraft could absorb such punishment and still limp home. But when the cockpit, the engines, or the fuel tanks remained largely untouched on the data charts, that silence spoke volumes. Those were the fatal hits, the ones no crew survived to report. Suddenly, the officers realized they had been listening only to the survivor. Their assumptions had been built on half a story, a narrative shaped by luck and endurance. Wald gave them the missing half, the graves in Europe and the wreckage scattered across fields and forests. The excitement was intellectual but also deeply practical. For the first time the invisible was quantified, the silence of the lost turned into guidance for the living. In that moment the mathematics of absence became a weapon as potent as any bomb. The men in the room leaned forward, gripped by the power of an idea that transformed their charts into a roadmap for survival. The missing planes had finally spoken, and through Wald their silence became the key to saving thousands more. Wald's reasoning spread across the table like sunlight breaking through clouds. To make his point clear, he avoided equations and instead turned to examples everyone could grasp. Imagine, he said, a soldier walking through a battlefield. If you only talk to the men who make it back, you might conclude the places they were hit as survivable. But the silence of those who never returned tells the real story. They were struck where it truly mattered. He pointed at the diagrams of the bombers, holes in the wing. Those planes still landed, holes in the fuselage, crews still walked away. But look at the engines, nearly untouched in the reports. That was not safety, it was tragedy hidden in plain sight. Every missing mark on the engines was a graveyard of a plane that had never returned. The officers nodded slowly as the simplicity sank in. They realized they had been pouring armor into the wrong places, reinforcing the parts that could take punishment rather than the ones that could not. By inverting their thinking, they now understood where every additional plate of steel needed to go. There was a quiet satisfaction in the room. The problem that had haunted them suddenly seemed solvable. The brilliance of Wald's insight was not in complexity, but in clarity. A kind of genius that made everyone else feel as though they should have seen it too. For the first time, survival seemed not just possible but practical. The decision to shift armor placement did not come easily. To the Army's engineers and commanders, it felt almost reckless to ignore the thick clusters of bullet holes on the surviving planes. Yet Abraham Wald's calm insistence and the sheer logic of his argument pushed them to test his theory. Orders went out to reinforce the engines, fuel lines and cockpit areas, the places with the fewest visible scars. Crews preparing for the next missions eyed the modifications with a mix of hope and doubt. For months they had seen comrades shot out of the sky, sometimes within minutes of crossing into enemy airspace. To them, the new armor distribution felt like gambling on an invisible hand. Some mechanics whispered that the changes wouldn't matter. Others clung to the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, they had been looking at the problem all wrong. As the first bombers rolled out of the hangars with their newly armored vital systems, tension gripped the airfields. Pilots strapped in, knowing they were part of a dangerous experiment. Ground crews stood in silence as the formations roared into the sky, wondering whether Wald's theory would prove genius or folly. Hours later, the sound of engines returning carried across the runways. To everyone's astonishment, more planes touched down than usual. They were still battered, wings and fuselages pocked with holes, but their engines kept turning, their cockpits remained intact, and their crews stepped out shaken but alive. It was not proof beyond doubt, but it was enough to ignite a spark. For the first time, survival rates seemed to tilt in their favor. Suspense hung in the air. Was this the turning point? The first missions with the revised armor became the talk of the airfield. When the bombers landed, ground crews ran forward, bracing for the usual grim count. But to their surprise, far more aircraft rolled back onto the runways than expected. Engines coughed and sputtered. Wings bore the familiar Swiss cheese pattern of flak and bullets. Yet the critical parts, the cockpits, fuel tanks and engines, had held firm. Crews stepped down, bruised, shaken, but alive. Word spread quickly. Pilots who had resigned themselves to staggering odds now spoke of a strange new feeling, the possibility of returning home. One veteran who had flown through countless missions admitted he had never felt this kind of relief. "We were hit just as hard," he said, "but the plane kept flying." That was new. The statistics soon backed up the stories. Loss rates that had hovered at terrifying levels began to dip. Even a modest percentage shift meant dozens of planes and hundreds of lives saved in just a few weeks. Each returning formation carried not just bombs dropped on target, but proof that an idea born in the quiet clarity of mathematics could bend the odds of survival. What had begun as a gamble now carried the weight of evidence. Confidence rippled through the crew. Armor was no longer scattered across the body of the plane but placed with purpose, and it worked. Relief replaced despair, and amazement took hold. Against all expectations, the B-17s were no longer flying coffins. They were at last fighting machines with a real chance of bringing their crews back alive. When the after-action reports reached higher command, the reaction was disbelief. Generals and senior officers had grown accustomed to grim statistics, to reading casualty numbers that felt almost routine in their horror. Yet the new missions with adjusted armor patterns told a different story. Loss rates were dropping in ways that defied expectation. Fewer telegrams were being sent to grieving families. More bombers returned limping but alive. Commanders pored over the numbers again and again, convinced there had to be an error. How could something as simple as shifting steel plates make such a difference? For months they had relied on brute force, pouring resources into production, hoping sheer numbers would offset staggering losses. Now it seemed a quiet mathematician with a chalkboard had saved more lives than any additional squadron of fighters. The awe grew as officers connected the dots. Ward's insight was not about building tougher planes, but about thinking differently. By listening to the silence of the missing bombers, he had uncovered what no inspection team or engineer had managed to see. To men hardened by war, it was a humbling moment. The vast machinery of command, the factories, the training, the strategies, had been outmaneuvered by a pencil and a fresh perspective. Meetings shifted from skepticism to respect. Ward's name began to circulate through corridors where few civilians were ever mentioned. His method was now standard practice, a quiet revolution spreading across the Air Force. Commanders who had doubted the power of theory now admitted, with a mix of awe and humility, that a mathematician had given their crews something no amount of propaganda could: a fighting chance to live. For years commanders had trusted what they could see. Armor went where bullet holes were thickest, strategies were shaped by visible damage, and logic seemed irrefutable. But the more they compared those old habits with Ward's approach, the more they realized how blind their assumptions had been. His reasoning wasn't brute force, it was elegant. He had turned absence into evidence, silence into data. The contrast was humbling. Traditional methods had led to a tragic cycle, patching wings and fuselages, while losing planes to the very weaknesses no one thought to reinforce. Ward's logic cut through that illusion with startling simplicity. By asking the right question, he shifted the focus from what was obvious to what was missing. It was a lesson that resonated beyond engineering, in war as in life. What you don't see often matters most. Officers spoke about the revelation with quiet admiration. This wasn't about charts or equations alone, it was about clarity of thought. Ward had shown them that true ingenuity doesn't always arrive with fanfare or complex machinery. Sometimes it emerges from a single mind daring to challenge convention. In the end, respect replaced skepticism. The old strategies had been crushed not by more steel or bigger bombs, but by insight, a reminder that wars are not won by strength alone but by the ability to think differently. For commanders who had prided themselves on experience and discipline, it was a lasting lesson in humility and admiration. The statistics told one story, but the letters home told another. In cramped bunks and noisy mess halls, airmen put pen to paper, trying to capture the relief of walking back onto solid ground after missions that should have ended in flames. The plane shook like the devil, one crewman wrote, but somehow she held together, and we made it back. Families clutched those words as proof that miracles could still happen in the skies over Europe. Prisoners of war who later reflected on those missions recalled the strange mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. One German interrogator, reading through captured letters, noted how American crews no longer wrote about expecting death, but about daring to hope for life. To men trained to believe in the inevitability of attrition, it was a revelation. Stories circulated of aircraft limping back with engines smoking, fuselages torn, and holes punched clean through the wings, yet they landed safely. Crews would stumble out bruised but alive, and offer thanks, not only to their luck but to the changes no one fully understood at the time. Ward's name never appeared in those letters, but the spirit of his insight lived in every homecoming. The human voices carried what numbers could not, a deep sense of gratitude. Survivors wrote of empty bunks that could have been theirs, of comrades who still lived because someone, somewhere had asked the right question. For every bomber that rolled back onto the runway, there was a family spared another telegram of loss. And for the crews, each landing was more than survival. It was a second chance, wrapped in relief and quiet thanksgiving. On the home front, the change was almost invisible at first. Telegram boys still rode their bicycles through neighborhoods, and black ribbons still appeared on doors. Yet gradually the dreadful knock on the door became less frequent. Families who had braced themselves for the worst began to notice a shift. Their sons were coming home on leave, Their letters arrived more regularly, and the silence that once followed each mission was replaced by cautious relief. In small towns across America, mothers whispered about the difference. "We haven't lost anyone from our block in weeks," one woman told her neighbor, clutching the latest letter from her boy overseas. Fathers who once read casualty lists with dread now allowed themselves the rare comfort of optimism. The weight of fear had not disappeared, but it was lighter, easier to carry. Wives and sweethearts noticed too. Letters no longer spoke only of death-defying odds, but of routine missions completed, and a sense that survival was possible. The tension that had gripped entire households eased ever so slightly, replaced by the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, their loved ones would come back alive. Communities gathered at train stations not just to mourn, but to welcome airmen returning for brief furloughs. The smiles, the embraces, and the tears of relief became the truest testament to the math that had saved them. Few knew Abraham Wald's name, but they lived the results of his insight. In kitchens, in church pews, and around dinner tables, families quietly celebrated what felt like a reprieve from fate. For them, the numbers meant more than charts. They meant lives spared, futures restored, and the hope that war might not steal everything after all. When the reports were compiled and the missions tallied, a quiet realization spread through command. This wasn't just a clever adjustment to armor. It was the uncovering of a principle that rewrote how they thought about evidence itself. Survivorship bias, though not yet widely named, had revealed the danger of trusting only what could be seen. The planes that limped home, riddled with holes, weren't examples of failure. They were proof of survival. The true lessons lay with the aircraft that never returned, the silent majority erased from the data. The brilliance of the idea struck officers and engineers alike with a sense of awe. All along they had been reinforcing the wrong places, pouring steel into areas that could take punishment without dooming the crew. Wald's insight illuminated the invisible, that survival leaves patterns, but those patterns don't tell the whole story. It was a revelation that demanded a new kind of thinking, one that sought out the missing pieces, not just the obvious ones. As the concept took root, its significance stretched beyond bombers. Commanders realized the same logic applied to intelligence reports, casualty counts, even battlefield rumors. What they saw was always filtered by who survived, who returned, who reported. What was missing mattered just as much as what was present. For men hardened by years of attrition, this was more than academic, it was humbling. They had prided themselves on practical knowledge, yet a quiet statistician had reminded them that clarity requires imagination as much as observation. In recognizing this, they felt the weight of a truth bigger than the war itself. Survival tells only half the story, and wisdom begins when you search for the unseen. The lesson of survivorship bias did not stay confined to airfields and briefing rooms. In the months that followed, the clarity of Wald's logic began to ripple outward. Commanders recognized that the same blind spots existed wherever people measured success by what remained visible. It wasn't just about bombers, it was about understanding that absence speaks as loudly as presence. Scientists began to adopt the framework, reminding one another to look for what was missing, not just what was easy to measure. In medicine, researchers later applied the same principle to clinical trials, asking, were they only studying the patients who survived treatment, while ignoring those who did? In business, executives would borrow the idea when assessing markets, realizing that focusing only on successful companies hides the lessons of those that failed. The clarity that emerged from this shift carried far beyond the war. For those who lived through it, the concept felt like a mental lens, a way of seeing the world more honestly. The families of airmen might not have known the phrase survivorship bias, but they lived its impact. Their sons came home because someone looked at the problem differently, saw what others ignored, and reshaped the odds of survival. The story of a quiet mathematician saving countless crews with nothing more than reasoning became a symbol of human ingenuity. Long after the guns fell silent, the insight remained a guide. Wisdom comes not just from what we see, but from asking what is missing. In the years after the war, the story of Abraham Wald's insight became more than a footnote in history. Among veterans, it was remembered as a quiet miracle, a math trick that tipped the odds of survival in their favor. Many airmen who returned from dangerous missions never knew the name of the man who had shaped their fate, yet they spoke of the sudden change when missions stopped feeling like suicide runs. Losses were still heavy, but the hopelessness had lifted. Pilots and gunners later recalled noticing that armor seemed better placed, covering the cockpit and fuel tanks, shielding the engines and critical areas. They didn't understand the calculations behind it, but they felt the difference. Each safe return was in its own way a testament to a man who had never flown in combat, yet had saved countless crews through reasoning alone. Historians would come to call it one of the most elegant applications of statistics in wartime. For the men who lived it, the math was personal. It meant another chance to see their families, another letter home, another sunrise after a night mission. The gratitude they carried was often quiet but deeply felt. Wald himself remained modest, his work a single piece of a larger war effort, but the legacy endured because it revealed something extraordinary, that survival could be improved not by building bigger weapons or spending more steel, but by rethinking the problem entirely. Respect for his brilliance grew with every retelling, as crews and commanders alike came to see the true power of ideas in saving lives. The brilliance of Abraham Wald's insight extended far beyond the skies of World War. What began as a practical solution to keep bomber crews alive became a timeless lesson in perspective. Survivorship bias, as it would later be called, taught that the most important evidence is often the absence. What doesn't make it back? What is missing from the obvious picture? Business leaders, scientists and strategists would study his work for decades, learning that understanding failure and absence can unlock critical truth. Yet for those who lived the B-17 missions, the lesson was immediate and personal. Paying attention to the unseen could mean the difference between life and death. Wald's logic didn't just improve aircraft, it reshaped thinking, encouraging careful observation, humility, and deeper analysis in every field it touched. The crews who survived told stories of how a simple reallocation of armor, guided by invisible data, had saved them. Families back home felt the ripple of this insight in letters and reunions, unaware that a statistician's mind had protected their loved ones. Each story, each returned plane, became a subtle celebration of the unseen work behind survival. By the time the war ended, Wald's contribution had entered the lexicon of applied intelligence and strategy. Students of history, mathematics, and management continue to cite his methods, proving that a single act of thoughtful analysis can echo across decades. For viewers reflecting on this story, the takeaway is clear: sometimes the smallest observation, when applied wisely, can have the most profound impact. Wald's legacy is not just the saved crews or reinforced bombers, it is a lesson in thinking differently, in looking beyond the obvious, and in valuing the unseen. It's a reminder that insight, reason, and courage of intellect are as vital as courage in battle, leaving audiences inspired by how a single mathematical insight could ripple through history to protect lives, shape decisions, and illuminate unseen truth.